to For All Humans. What do you think of when you hear the word refugee? Many of us will think of the recent movement of people from war-torn countries such as Syria and Afghanistan, and those people escaping instability and poverty in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps you'll think of the large numbers of people arriving on boats in Greece and Italy in recent years. Should all these groups of people be referred to as refugees? What makes a refugee? How has modern society responded to the refugee crisis we have recently witnessed? We will explore these questions and also seek to understand what the Islamic understanding of refugees is and how they should be received and treated. To do this, we will have a look at how early Muslim refugees were granted asylum in the early years of the religion, as in the case of the Christian King Negus, and the example of the Muhajirun, the immigrants, and Ansar, the helpers. We'll see how Islamic humanitarian approaches can reinforce the sanctity of refugees. Can historical Islamic approaches to refugee protection guide present-day policymakers? And in particular, can Muslim governments craft responses to contemporary refugee issues that are in keeping with the established Islamic principles and practices as an example to the rest of the world? Media coverage of refugees has gone a long way to shape the public consciousness. However, the language and the discourse used by the media has often painted refugees in a negative light. The rhetoric in many countries within Western Europe continues to maintain a keep them out syndrome, encouraged by populist and far-right groups. When an EU relocation scheme was codified in 2015, Slovakia stated it would only accept Christians when taking in refugees from Syria, and Muslims would not be accepted because they would not feel at home. The building of the border wall in the US along its border with Mexico to keep out illegal migrants has garnered much attention. However, it seems that this approach is actually not such a far-fetched idea when nation-states attempt to protect their own borders. Would it surprise you to know that wall building has actually been a popular reaction to migration in Western Europe too? Hungary has built a fence along its border with Serbia, and Spain has used fences in Ceuta and Melilla, Bulgaria along its border with Turkey, and new walls have also been constructed in Calais. Within this context, it's interesting to note that there are more than 1 billion regional and international migrants globally. This number is only set to grow. In the next 50 years, for example, the number of refugees may further increase due to the effects of climate change, creating so-called climate change refugees. Before we continue, it will be useful for us to distinguish between migrants and refugees. These words are often used interchangeably, but there are nuances between the words, and they have legal and other implications. The UNHCR describes a refugee or refugees as persons fleeing armed conflict or persecution. Refugees cross national borders in the search for safety. The status of refugee recognises that it is too dangerous for the individual to return home, and the denial of asylum could have potentially deadly consequences. Refugees have many protections, and one of which is to ensure respect of their basic human rights and to allow them to live in dignity and in safety, while also helping them find a longer-term solution. Migrants, on the other hand, choose to move not because of a direct threat of death or persecution, but to improve their chances of finding work, education, or to reunite with family. Unlike refugees, migrants would not face hostility if they returned to their home country. Returning to the question of how we classify the large numbers of individuals arriving in Western Europe by boats, we can say that these people include both refugees and migrants. The majority of individuals on board are refugees, they are escaping war, and they require international protection afforded under the status of refugee. However, a small number of individuals who may be looking to arrive in Western Europe to improve their quality of life, for example, they would more accurately be classified as migrants. Having explored some of the contemporary issues surrounding refugees, let's now consider this issue from an Islamic lens by exploring events in Islamic history and how we might learn from and apply lessons learnt from the past to the present-day society. Within an Islamic framework, humans are understood to be natural migrants, and migration is actually viewed in a very positive light. In fact, migration and faith are intertwined in many verses. The Quran not only talks about the act of migration, it also touches upon those we have classed as refugees in this research. For example, those who migrate are praised. Those who believed and migrated and struggled in the way of God are those who are hopeful of the mercy of God. God is forgiving and merciful. For those not having migrated in the face of persecution are asked, wasn't the land of God large enough that you could have migrated? And further promise of reward, those who are migrating in the way of God will find refuge and prosperity. Indirectly, this also suggests that those with authority and those in a position to do so should actually take care of refugees, as here God is positioned as the owner of the land. Having explored some relevant verses in the Quran, we can also learn some uplifting and heartwarming lessons in relation to some of the earliest Muslim refugees within early Islamic history, migrations which directly involved the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad. The first example involves a Christian king, Negus, offering refuge to a group of 83 Muslims, and we can say they were refugees fleeing persecution in Mecca. When the Quran began to be revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, he and the small community of Muslims faced intense persecution from the Meccans. In the 6th year of Muhammad's prophethood, 83 Muslims left Mecca for Abyssinia, now modern-day Ethiopia, to seek refuge. The Prophet did not travel with the group at this time, but he gave them approval to do so. Abyssinia was a Christian kingdom in which Muhammad knew that the small group of Muslims would be safe. The Christian king, Negus, received the Muslim refugees, and he refused to hand them over to a group of Meccan leaders who wanted the Muslim community returned to Mecca. Such was the bond between the Prophet Muhammad and Negus that the Prophet performed a funeral prayer in absentia for him. The second example, which we'll cover now, explores the second notable act of migration, this time including the Prophet Muhammad himself. It is a longer and detailed example, and for the purposes of this topic, it deserves to be covered fully. It will be several years after the first migration to Abyssinia that Prophet Muhammad himself and the young community of Muslims came under threat again. Not only did this young Muslim community come under intense persecution, the wealthy elites of Mecca imposed a harsh economic boycott against the Prophet and the Muslim community, lasting for over 3 years. This set of circumstances spurred the largest and most significant migration in the history of Islam, known as the Hijra, Arabic for migration. This migration from Mecca to Medina, then called Yathrib, is so significant that it actually marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. The Western equivalent date of the Hijra is the 13th of September, 622 AD. Medina, the city to which the Prophet and his followers migrated, actually wanted the Prophet to use his peacekeeping skills to improve the relationship between the various tribes of Medina. You see, the city of Medina was both multicultural and multi-religious. Muslims only made up 15% of the population, alongside Arab idol worshippers, Jewish tribes, and pagans. The Prophet Muhammad established the foundations of a pluralistic society and actually developed the constitution of Medina to ensure that all members of society could live under the principles of equity and religious freedom. This document existed more than 13,000 years before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And how did the Prophet and the new Muslim arrivals integrate into the Medinan city and way of life? This would be a challenge given that they were financially weak and had no possessions, all their belongings being left behind in Mecca. Here, the Prophet Muhammad was instrumental in getting the new immigrant Muslim community to integrate and blend in with the existing, albeit small, established Muslim community in Mecca. To achieve this, the Prophet declared a bond of brotherhood between every Meccan immigrant and every local Medinan Muslim. As mentioned in the introduction, the immigrants were known as the Muhajirun, meaning immigrants, and the local Medinans as the Ansar, meaning helpers. The Quran says the men who stayed in their own city, Medina, and embraced Islam before them loved those who have sought refuge with them. They do not covet what they are given, but rather prefer their brothers and sisters above themselves, although they are in need. Those who preserve themselves from their own greed shall surely prosper. In this incredible example, the Ansar shared their wealth, housing, food, and their farms with the Muhajirun. So strong and successful was the integration of the Muhajirun with the Ansar that many of the immigrant Muslims received legal rights from the insistence of the Ansar. Indeed, when one of the Ansar died, the Muhajirun brother would be his heir. This help, on the basis of brotherhood, created a warm environment for immigrants and ultimately strengthened the Medinan society. Here, outsider immigrants, including women and Africans, were blended into the hierarchy of society. The brotherhood prevented antagonism on the grounds of tribalism and race, and arrogance on the basis of wealth. At this point, we can consider the implications and learning from those two cases, that of the Christian King Negus and the Muhajirun and Ansar in our modern-day context, where manifold crises see refugee populations being driven in ever higher numbers ever further afield. We struggle to find equivalent examples of help, support and sacrifice towards refugee communities today. As this research highlighted early on, racism and the divisive mentality of us versus them tends to dominate current attitudes towards refugees. We can mention some of the hopeful cases in regards to the response and welcome of refugee populations. Germany early on adopted an integration and welcome politics model for a European refugee policy. There were almost 1.2 million people who applied for asylum in Germany during the height of the migrant crisis in 2015 and 2016. The German government has also shown generosity in distributing aid packages to these arriving refugees. This show of support for refugees can be compared to the shelter, protection and hospitality given to the Muslim refugees by the Christian King Negus. Moreover, the refugees have made solid contributions to the German economy. 35% of refugees arriving in 2015 had found employment by 2018. This is encouraging considering the language and qualification barriers that the refugees would have to have faced in the labour market. Furthermore, given Germany's declining fertility rates and shrinking working age population, these refugees will be contributing to the long-term health of the country. The Sicilian town of Sutera saw welcoming refugees as a chance to repopulate and revive itself. Many people had moved out from the small town to find work in bigger cities, leaving behind a ghost town. In 2018, there were 50 asylum seekers living in the town. Schools and local businesses have once again begun to prosper. Sutera became a symbol for integration, so much so that the neighbouring towns of Mazzarino and Milena welcomed their own asylum seekers to seek similar benefits to Sutera. In the UK, during the migrant crisis of 2015 and 2016, many charities sprung up to connect those with spare rooms in their homes with asylum seekers and refugees who were and continue to be in need of accommodation. This show of hospitality and solidarity was akin to that seen in the previous example of the Ansar people towards the Muhajirun. This scheme saw both Muslims and non-Muslims make a real difference to the lives of refugees on a small local scale. However, most refugees don't see such positive outcomes. We see Muslims amongst the many diverse populations of refugees being driven from their homelands and forced to seek refuge elsewhere. Some, such as the Rohingya, are denied citizenship, actively persecuted, killed, and forced into the role of the other to better help a fractured Myanmar hold together its own national identity in a time of transition. Some, such as the Syrians, have fled their homelands en masse to escape a protracted and bloody civil war, the result of internal pressures and external meddling by several regional and global powers. We see Muslim refugees all over the globe, just like their fellow non-Muslim refugees, embodying the Quranic instruction to migrate in order to find safety, prosperity, and freedom from persecution. So this topic has shown us what rewards helping refugees could bring to the individual, the nation, and beyond. The selfless show of brotherhood as seen in the case of the Muhajirun and Ansar shines a guiding light from the past to the present, not only for Muslims but non-Muslims and nation-states around the world. This example from Islamic history gives us a gold standard to follow and instruction on how to contribute and be part of humanity. However, an eroding of the politics of compassion and a reluctance to help has meant that refugees fleeing persecution, war and hardship find themselves in incredibly difficult situations. The Islamic imagination and tradition gives us the answers on how to help those most vulnerable in society. A reconnection to this imagination would mean hope is not lost for our refugee brothers and sisters. The theme for the 2019 World Refugee Day was "Take a Step with Refugees." What step will you take?
We hope you enjoyed this episode, so let us know what you think in the comments section. Meanwhile, share this with your friends and stay tuned for the next one.